Hello, I'm Michael Climbs and I'm the news editor of Money Marketing. And I'm very happy to welcome you to our post-budget breakdown. Today, I'm joined by a long-term friend of Money Marketing, the esteemed Chris Jones from Dynamic Planner. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you for having me, and thank you for saying I'm esteemed. So,
no false praise or modesty on this show. Chris, we've just been working, had a very intense afternoon covering the autumn budget. It's Rishi Sunak's third budget. Yep. He became Chancellor in February 2020. It's amazing to think how the world has changed since then. It's been 18 months, but it's felt like longer than 2 months. What were your key takeaways from the budget today?
I think it was a very impressive budget speech, as have the last few. I think it's very optimistic. I think at some point you sort of feel very, very proud about it all. And I think a lot of that might be a testimony to his delivery, as well as obviously the fact that perhaps it is what the country needed. I think they've done quite a few things that will appeal to the common man. Mm-hmm. I think the levelling up thing is becoming more and more real after Boris's election, so they are appearing to generally try to make working class people earn more, people around the countries earn more. The idea of supporting the pubs, idea of supporting small British businesses, creating a number of post-Brexit biases towards British businesses can only make you feel good when you're listening to it. Well, as you obviously work through it, I think the big elephant in the room, which was obviously hitting the press long before the budget, is inflation. It's difficult to see what measures of a material nature in the budget were attempting to mitigate inflation. There's a few which were nominal. For example, if all the shipping companies moved to Southampton, then there'd be less levies on shipping, and there's some cuts in the basic costs of an HGV license, and perhaps opportunities for that supply to increase. But beyond that, everything else seems to continue to support business, which is great, and support people's incomes. But that is in itself going to be, you would imagine, inflationary.
You talked about being an impressive budget, and you mentioned the word delivery, and I think what you mean by that, if I'm interpreting it correctly, is that Rishi is seen as a smooth operator, and he's telegenic, he's good at the party conference and good with the sound bites. But in terms of the substance, how much substance do you think was there in the budget today?
His numbers are good. Most people listening to this, including myself, it's good to have good numbers. So he was fortunate in the fact that everything he said obviously has to be true when it comes to the numbers, and you can check them in the document. So what has happened to date is impressive. So therefore, obviously, he's quite right to be able to turn to those. I think looking at the projections going forward and the timing of the impact of some of the measures, there is a disconnect, and I suppose we were a little bit sceptical or perhaps just hopeful that they would work 2 years ago or a year ago, and they did work. So well done him. But I think now, just looking at the forecasts, there is obviously an inflection point, perhaps when some of the stimuluses that have been offered or extended come to an end. Some of the numbers get very tight in terms of GDP forecasts and inflation forecasts, where perhaps the longer term incentives that are also part of the budget haven't come into play yet, and it does have this sort of, it feels like there could be a difficult a period in a couple of years, just looking at the numbers. And so if he gets it right, he gets it right. But there is risk in the plan.
There is scope for error. And where do you think the biggest potential banana skin is for him? He's obviously got these targets and he wants to achieve them by a certain time. Where is he most vulnerable, do you think?
I think it's the inflation. Looking at the contribution of the inflation in the report comes from the goods, and it looks like the energy costs haven't run through yet, and it looks like the labour costs haven't run through yet. A lot of the plans, whether it's increased expenditure on public sector or whether it's in infrastructure, are calling for more labour. And we know that obviously there's already a lot high demand for workforce for lots of reasons. Obviously specific to us, localised is Brexit, and you've also got globally that's happening. People are choosing to retire more because they realise they can, or they like not working. The other interesting number in the report is the productivity per hour within the same sort of thing, and we're looking at about 0.5 now, and budgeting to increase to 0.9 next year, up to 1.3. So we know that not only do you have a challenge as a business in terms of your obtaining staff, is that not to criticise any particular individual, everyone thinks they work hard, but according to the economic measures, is that productivity is down. People are working from home in inverted commas as much as they are working from home in reality, and that's in the numbers as well. So it does, it relies on the people, it relies on people actually working harder for the actual plan to work, which may or may not happen.
And final two questions. In terms of the inflation threat, as you understand it, is this a little bit of inflation, or is this 1970s style potential inflation, or it's too hard to say?
I think the problem you've got is that we don't think it's going to be huge inflation, but it's going to be material inflation, and it could pop some normalisation in inflation and normalisation of interest rates as well. And the reality of that is that when you have got an economy where capital is basically free, and then all of a sudden, interest rates and inflation go up by what appears to be negligible compared to the 70s, the impact on households and businesses can be quite extreme. Right. Or long duration bonds. It could be, you don't need you're talking about the 23 billion extra cost of the Treasury of a 1% interest rate rise, but you start factoring that through on some of the the bond yields and things, and that starts to make a big difference. And so it wouldn't, we're not talking about 70s style inflation or hyper style inflation for it to be a problem, but we are looking at a situation where any kind of deviation could cause a problem. I think we have to. The other thing I think we have to do is accept that even if he's right, so he's saying it'll peak at 4.4. If they keep the target rate at 2, we acknowledge that there is going to be short-term inflation because of that. Like when we're queuing up the petrol stations, certain things like that. It might be that we can't get staff now, but then in 6 months' time we can, right? So it could just be entirely short term. But what you're going to have is you're going to have this disconnect between the numbers that people like us talk about, and we put in, say, a financial plan, or we put into a modelling tool, and the reality faced by the individual, because we've never had that before. Most of us have lived in a period of stable interest rates, but we could have a scenario where, all of a sudden, cost of living goes up dramatically, so I go and get another job, but it takes me 6 months to get another job, so therefore, and then the interest, it's this sort of, the volatility that we had in the 80s and early 90s, it was the uncertainty that caused the problems on the ground, even if you can look back and go, well, that's absolutely fine, it sort of manages itself out over time. But these sort of numbers that we use when we're talking like the budget or we're doing financial plans, we've got to remember that it's when it's actually happening to you, it's not quite as simple as that, because you can't see it. All you can see is that you've got these problems to deal with on the ground, and they're problems that people haven't dealt with for a while. So I think when the COVID thing broke, I think financial advisors really learnt to help people deal with their own real life situations and did some great things. It might be that they just have to learn to help clients to manage through their incomes and outgoings, expenditures, and the short-term rationality of their life decisions, and perhaps a little bit of reassurance and common sense, as well as have a long-term plan, which will even itself out. You will get, I'm sure we will have probably lower interest rates and lower inflation in the big picture over the next 10, 20 years or whatever. I'm sure that's probably not sure it happened, but you can imagine it would happen. But that's irrelevant if right now you have to pay twice as much for something, So the big picture stuff is important, but you also need to recognise that people are going to have to deal with some difficult income and outgoing challenges, perhaps having been brought up in a society where credit was immediately available. I could have what I wanted. Everything, amusement prices going down. This could just be a small social shock for a lot of people.
And final question: if you were to give the budget a score out of 10, how much would you give Rishi?
Having said all that, it was really good, wasn't it? So, he's got his numbers together. He's pulled it off. It's a 9 out of 10. I do miss George Osborne. That would give us a new tax rapper to play every year and made the job much more fun. But no, in terms, apart from not giving us so much interesting things to talk about, apart from that, I'd say 9 out of 10.
That's very, very high. Thank you, Chris. That's excellent insight. And thank you for your time.